Welcome to Facing the Canon. My guest on the program is Sir Brian Souter, founder of the Stagecoach transport company and a philanthropist. Sir Brian Souter, welcome to Facing the Canon.
Good to be with you.
Now, you've got a lovely Scottish accent, and are you speaking to us from Scotland?
Yes, I'm speaking to you from our home city of Perth.
And that's where you were born and brought up, Brian?
Yeah, that's right. My folks were in Perth, and then we started a bus company. And Perth was a great location because it's sort of a hub and sit in the middle of Scotland. So it was a good place for us to start our long distance bus company.
Let's go back to the beginning. Now, you were brought up, your parents were Christians, and you were brought up in a Christian home. Your mother played the piano and the organ, and you tended to go to how many church meetings every week?
Well, I think I counted up, I was at 7 meetings a week. She even took me to the women's meeting, and I had to stand in a chair, and sing "Jesus Wants Me" for a sunbeam.
Oh,
I'm
my
still
word.
working through that with my therapist, you know.
But your mum was very bold about her faith. She even, on buses, she would speak and sing on buses. What was that like?
Well, I mean, she was very bold in her faith, and she would, you know, if she got blessed, she would be singing, and she would testify to people in the shops and at the bus stop. And you know, we're on the bus, and she's singing, you know, what a friend we have in Jesus, you know, and I'm sitting there saying, I wish she would be quiet, you know, everybody's staring at us, you know, and I'm thinking if she goes on like this, then the only friend I'll have is Jesus, you know, because everybody thinks we're so weird, you know.
I know, but you know, the thing is, Brian, that there are probably people who heard your mother singing on that bus and it touched them. And maybe we don't know the story, but we'll hear the story in heaven, that someone will go to your mother, "Oh, thank you so much for singing that song on the bus. That helped me come to faith." We just don't know, do we? These, you know, so it's one. Now, your father, he was a bus driver and he drove cars, but there's a lovely story about one particular day when he drove 3 different vehicles. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, he was a prolific worker, actually. And so my mother did all this work in the church, but she used to always say she could only do that because he funded it and supported her in what she was doing in the church. But yeah, he was on the first bus that morning, taking people down to the mill, and a woman traveled on that. And then she went to a funeral in the afternoon, and he was driving the hearse. And because he used to work with an undertaker. And then at night, she went to the bingo, and she thought, oh, I'm tired, I'll get a taxi home. And so she got a taxi, and he was driving the taxi. And she said to him, "How many jobs have you got, mister?" You know,
Yes.
because he turned up all the time. So he was a great worker and actually had accumulated quite a lot of capital.
Yes.
And he actually was the main funder of the bus company.
Now, what about you, Brian? When did you kind of move on from knowing about Jesus to committing and submitting your life to Jesus? When did that happen for you?
Well, you know, listen to the gospel week by week and realize that while I'm saturated in this gospel message and I understand a lot about it, I realized that I had to make the decision for myself. And so I didn't respond in the service one night. There was a message, and I didn't respond in the service. But when I went home, I asked my mother to pray with me. And so I knelt at my bedside in our council house, and I asked the Lord to come into my heart. And you know, J.John, I can still remember the enormous feelings of forgiveness and happiness and joy that flowed over me when I made that simple prayer. I know that that doesn't always happen to people when they make that prayer of faith, but I think when you're a child and you have no sophistication and you just embrace Jesus, you know. So that was when I made that decision. Now, in my teenage years, I then had to come to an intellectual understanding
Yes.
about it. And we had a great pastor at that time. And so I went through that. And there was a point in my teenage years when I said, no, I'm just going to commit my life wholly to Jesus, you know,
Yes.
and seek the Holy Spirit in my life. And so that was something I did at one of these campaigns
Yeah.
that you know, people were pushing us to make a full consecration of our lives to
Surrender.
Jesus.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Brian, yesterday was my spiritual birthday. And just as you said about when you received Christ, and you can still remember the moment and the experience, it was the same for me, because a transformation takes place, and it really changes our life and the trajectory of our life as well. And it certainly did for you. Now, you ended up going to university, and when you were a student at university, you were also a bus driver, a bus conductor on the buses. So how did you manage to be a full-time student and have a full-time job?
Well, I didn't have much choice because I studied a teaching qualification, and then I decided that I didn't want to be a teacher. I wanted to be an accountant, but it was a business studies qualification. So to get into the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, which is quite a kind of exclusive accounting group or whatever, you had by that time to have a degree. So I can't do maths. I have a mental block about, I'm sure I would be diagnosed these days with all sorts of illnesses. But anyway, people back in the day just thought you were stupid or whatever. So I couldn't do maths, but I could do arithmetic. I mean, if you take away X and Y and put a pound sign, I pick it up quite fast, really. So I went on, did a degree in accountancy at Glasgow, but I'd used my grant by that time. So I went full-time on the buses in Glasgow, which was quite an experience because it was quite a wild part of Glasgow. We worked on some of our services went up through Castle Milk and so forth, you know. So it was an education in
What
itself.
time did you start in the morning on the buses?
Well, my duty started at 4:49. So I that was my I had a steady shift all the time. I was the first sign-on in the depot. So I used to do that, and then I had what you used to call spread over, split duties. So I used to do split duties. Sometimes I traded my 4:49 for a split duty, and I went into the university during the day. So they were pretty flexible. I could often change my shifts. So I would turn up at university wearing my bus conductor's uniform.
Yes.
And, you know, for all that the students, you know, all these students were sort of, you know, that was the time of the hippies and all this kind of stuff, you know, and everyone's trying to throw over convention. But actually, you know, like people were like, you can sort of stare at me because I was wearing this bus conductor's uniform. You know, I thought it was a bit weird. Not that many people actually spoke to me. And I walked into a lecture once, and it was about a tramway company. And I didn't know this. It was a legal lecture and about this tramway company's case. And I walked in the middle of the lecture, and everybody burst out laughing. So I walked up to him and rang a ticket up on my machine and gave him the ticket and just went and sat down.
Absolutely brilliant. Now, you were also at the church, you joined a band as well, and you were touring in the band, the Christian band. What memory? Tell us a memory of that time.
Yeah, well, I had some friends had started this band, and they asked me if I would join the band. So it was called Gravel and Boulders. It was
Gravel and Boulders.
So we used to go around churches and prisons and places like that with this gospel band. A lot of churches weren't very keen on us because of the noise and the music and all the rest of it. And so it was, and I used to do the speaking with the band. So I was the evangelist really with the band. And so one of my friends, one of the nights, they said, "Oh, out in the audience, someone had said to somebody else, just look at him. He must have had such a hard life before he became a Christian," because I had very bad acne and had a big hypertrophic scar from a car accident. And I think people thought I'd been in a knife fight or something. But of course, I came to know the Lord when I was 10-year-old.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, there's so much more to your story, Brian, but if we can press on to when you and your sister started your company, Stagecoach, how did that first begin? And where did you get the original support to be able to do that?
Right. Well, I mean, having worked on the buses, and I used to sometimes be on a shift and I work out how much contribution they were making off these bus services. And I'm thinking, these companies were all in state ownership at that time. But I'm thinking some of these bus services are really profitable and they're not, we could do the job a lot better or whatever. So Margaret Thatcher came into office, and the first experiment she conducted was she deregulated the long distance bus services, just the long distance bus services. So I had been working as an accountant in Aberdeen, and so I worked with an accountancy firm, and I still kept my job on the buses on a Saturday night, which was an interesting experience. But anyway, I still had this contact with transport, and I knew there was all this business going to Aberdeen. It was a terrible place to get to at that time. So there's an oil boom going on, and the infrastructure's not great either. So I came up with this idea: we'll run bus services across Scotland, and we'll also compete with the state carrier going to London from Scotland. But we'll give food on the bus and we'll put blankets on the bus. So this really caught on. But in the early days, with this cross Scotland services, the first bus from Aberdeen only had 3 people on it. So the only people that really believed in me were my father, who put £25,000 of his money into the business, and my sister, who put her house up to the bank and borrowed against her house, and I had 15,000 in savings. So we put our money in, and then I thought at one point that we were going to go bankrupt, and I began to really be concerned about it, and I realized I got a verse in James that said, "Don't say I'm going to go into this city and that city and trade for a year and do this and do that. Take each day as it comes and don't be anxious," right? And I felt convicted by the Holy Spirit about the fact I was having so much anxiety. And so I realized that I had got too much emotional investment into the bus company, and that had sort of displaced the Lord's place in my life. We say we've surrendered, but we keep taking things back. New things come into our life, and we don't always surrender them or whatever. And that's what happened with this. And so I prayed and I said, "Lord, I'm surrendering this bus company across to you. If it's successful, it'll be because you made it a success.
Yes.
And if it's not successful, I'll accept that." And then the railway drivers, ASLEF, went on strike for 2 months.
and they all needed a bus.
The only way you could get across Scotland was on one of these buses and we only had a handful of buses. We had some old clunkers, and we put bigger engines and bigger gearboxes on them and everything. And we're saying to people, keep traveling, we've got buses on order, And then, as they say, the rest of it is history.
It's history. But isn't it interesting, the little links in the chain? But how wonderful that you had this little struggle with the Lord, but then you totally surrendered your life and your business to him.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because as Christians often, I felt that when I was doing a lot of work in the church, and I was still doing the band and everything. It was just that this stress experience with the business was new for me, and I was carrying it all and not surrendering that over. You know what I mean? So it was getting to that point and realizing this company has become very dominant in my life now, and I actually need to give it over to the Lord, you know? And
Yes.
I would say that there are other points in your life as well when you realize there's things that you just need to say, Lord, I can't do this. You know, why? I don't know why we keep doing this. We keep carrying it ourselves when we don't need to. You know, it's a lesson that I'm still learning, as it were. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Well, it reminds me, Brian, of that scripture where Jesus said, "Come unto me, all those of you that are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." And it surprises us, doesn't it, really? Why on earth do we carry it when we can give it to the Lord? Brian, so you started with one bus. How many buses did it grow eventually to?
Yeah, well, at the kind of peak of it, we had 14,000 buses, 3,000 trains, and some ferries as well.
And how many people did you employ?
38,000 people.
So when you and your sister Anne first started Stagecoach, did you ever anticipate that it would grow like that?
Not really. I mean, I think we just took advantage of an opportunity, and then there was more and more opportunities came. So we just kept taking advantage of the opportunities, really.
And obviously, you know, being a Christian, a follower of Jesus, you endeavored to run the company with Christian values and principles.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't have a policy where we just employed Christians, you know, but we always tried to make sure that, you know, fairness and honesty, we had pretty good relationships with our trade unions that we dealt with. And yeah, I think people tended to stay with us a long time, which is always a good sign, I think, in a company. And there's
Absolutely.
also this thing about mutually respecting other people's views, you know?
Yes, definitely. I know. Well, it's running it with integrity and honesty, and respect, really. And obviously, the Lord blessed you. You eventually sold the company. What prompted you to sell it?
Well, we had a minority interest in it. You know, that it was a quoted company, so the family had 26% holding in it, and I always felt it was like a project, and I never felt it was like going to be a family succession business, really. And there wasn't really anybody else in the family that interested. I mean, you don't want to burden your children with expectations, and you want them to do what they're happy doing or whatever, you know. So
Absolutely.
I felt that there was a season for the company, and I felt that that season had come to an end. And back to that thing about feeling a peace about it, you know, and that thing about, you know, not being anxious about the company. You know, there was times when the share price was high, share price was low, different things happened to us, but I never had anxiety after that initial um, encounter when I surrendered the company over to the Lord. And I did feel it's interesting at the end because I thought we were going to do a merger. And I said to Anne, I don't really know how this is going to work out, but I've got a peace about it. I feel that it's in the Lord's hands. And then someone came through, an infrastructure fund came through with a bigger cash offer. And you know, it was the right thing for us, absolutely the right thing for us. So what we tried to do after that was really my interest now is really principally with Souter Investments, which I set up to keep the charitable trust funded, because the charitable trust is an important part of our story. Started that with Betty in 1992.
And what prompted it originally to start? What was it?
Well, we'd always tithed and gave our offerings over and above our tithe. But when we realized that there's going to maybe be quite a lot of money coming, if I just put all that money into the local church, they wouldn't have known what to have done with it. So we said, right, we'll set up a charitable trust because we feel the Lord has given us a wider stewardship for the kingdom. The Lord has enabled us to give a lot of money through that medium.
Wonderful. How there's so much need, Brian, everywhere. There's so much need in the church. There's so much need in Christian ministry. How do you and your wife Betty, how do you discern how to be a good guardian and a good steward of the assets the Lord has entrusted to you?
Yeah, I think one of the principles that we have is that if the Holy Spirit is moving and blessing a ministry, then that's where we should put the money to enable. So
Yes.
we don't do property because we think that God's kingdom isn't really about property. And so we prioritize human need and evangelism. And not all of our money goes to Christian agencies, because the Lord told us to feed the hungry, heal the sick, and set the captives free. We will use a secular agency to do that. But the vast majority goes to Christian agencies because they are so full of passion. We get much better value for our money. We've got all these volunteers helping. And when the Lord's hands on the ministry, that differentiates it, and often the results are amazing.
Absolutely, Brian. Now, what are you sensing God's doing in Scotland, your homeland? My wife Killy and I were there recently, and we just sensed that there were signs of revival. What do you sense?
Yeah, we have exactly the same sense just now. We are seeing a lot of young people coming into our churches. We are seeing, and it's interesting, a lot of these people have not been invited to church.
Yeah.
They had a spiritual encounter before they came to church. It's a very unusual phenomenon. And it's partly the Holy Spirit using YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and all the social media. But we're also hearing about people having dreams, visions, the Lord just speaking to them. And then they're coming into our churches. And what a responsibility for those of us that are Christians that are in the church. We have to be ready. This could turn into a real tsunami of revival and blessing. But my concern just now is the state of the church for these people coming in. And we just want to embrace them, let them know that we love them, that the Lord loves them, give them good sound teaching, and give them avenues for service and Bible study and ability for them to grow their faith. So I've never experienced this before. I was in a gospel band for years. I'm still involved in children's ministries and stuff, but I have never experienced. So at New Year, my son had a party, and I said, Callum, I would like to just say a few words at this party, right? And my wife said, they'll not listen to you. And I just gave before midnight 3 minutes. And I talked about the wise men, and they came to Jerusalem, and their question was, where can we find Jesus? Or where is the Messiah, right? And I just said about, that they weren't from that culture, they're from a different country, they're a different creed altogether, but they wanted to find Jesus. They had this urge and search for meaning in their life and to try to follow what was happening. They could see things were changing around about them. And I said, I feel that a lot of you are having the same feelings in your life. You're searching, you're looking, and maybe you're asking the question, where will you find Jesus? And 15 or 20 of them came up to me afterwards and said, we're so glad you shared that. And I said, if you want to find out more, why in 2026, why don't you do Alpha? It's a great way to find out more about Jesus. And my son just started an Alpha last night with that friendship group, and 7 of them are doing Alpha with him.
Wonderful.
And I mean, to me, I've never seen this type of positive response. So it's interesting. It's Gen Z that are searching. They're fed up with woke, right? When the millennials are not so enthusiastic about this. One of the challenges we have in the church is there's a graph from the Bible Society about the quiet revival. And Gen Z, there's piles of them going to church. And then down the bottom of the graph with the millennials and all the middle-aged people, there's just a few more going to church. And then over 65, it's enormous again. And this over 65 group, that it's not returned to church, it's old people have never been to church. And they're now taking an interest in it. We've seen it in our church. Some of the testimonies of these young people and these older people, the last Alpha was full of Gen Z and over 65s. It's unbelievable what's happening.
Amazing. Brian, you are an evangelist. You were an evangelist in that band. I think you're still an evangelist. You should come to our evangelist conference in January. But listen, Brian, it is wonderful to hear a little of your story. And the verse that comes to my mind as I hear a bit of your own story, Brian, is where it says in Chronicles, those who honor me, I will honor. And you and your sister and Anne and your wife, Betty, and your family have honored God, and God has honored you. And it's wonderful to hear what you're doing now. Brian, may the Lord continue to bless you and your family in all that you do for him and with him. Thank you, Brian, for joining us on Facing the Canon.
Thank you.
I really hope you've enjoyed that conversation with Sir Brian Souter. I certainly found it very inspiring. Thank you for joining us on Facing the Canon. Please join us again.